Mom, can you not comment on my posts? It's kind of embarrassing. The words hit me like ice water, freezing every breath in my lungs. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Sharon Ellen Foster. I am 67 years old, born and raised in Traverse City, Michigan, where the cherry blossoms bloom every spring like God's own promise of renewal. I have one son, Tyler, had one dream, to be the kind of mother who would never be forgotten, never be left behind. For most of my life, I lived for both my son and that dream, until the day I realized that neither remembered who I really was. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in March when it happened. The kind of day when Lake Michigan's waves whispered against the shore, and I could smell the promise of spring in the air through my small apartment window. I had been sitting at my kitchen table, the one John and I bought 32 years ago at a garage sale, its wooden surface worn smooth by countless family meals and homework sessions. My Bible lay open beside my morning coffee, Psalm 23, as always, because I needed to remember that I was not walking through any valley alone. The steam from my cup curled upward like incense, and I whispered my morning prayer. Lord, let today bring me closer to my son. Let him feel your love through mine. It was the same prayer I'd offered every morning for the past 3 years, since John passed from cancer and left me navigating this world of silence and loneliness. My phone buzzed against the table. Tyler had posted a photo, him holding his newborn daughter, my first and only grandchild, little Emma Rose. She was perfect, all pink cheeks and tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. My heart swelled like a balloon about to burst. This was my blood, my legacy, the continuation of the Foster name that John and I had built together through 35 years of marriage. Without hesitation, my fingers moved across the screen, typing what felt like the most natural thing in the world. God bless your little family, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Love, Mom. I added a heart emoji and hit send, feeling that familiar warmth that comes when you've shared love freely, the way Jesus taught us to. I went about my morning routine, washing the single coffee cup, making the single bed, straightening the small living room that echoed with emptiness. I dusted the framed photograph of Tyler's high school graduation, where he stood tall and handsome in his cap and gown, my arm around his shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. That was back when he still needed me, still called me Mama sometimes when he was tired or hurt. 3 hours later, my phone chimed with a message notification. My pulse quickened. Maybe Tyler was thanking me for the comment. Maybe sending another picture of the baby. I fumbled for my reading glasses, the ones I kept on a beaded chain that had belonged to my mother, and opened the message. Mom, can you not comment on my posts? It's kind of embarrassing. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. Each letter remained exactly where it was, forming sentences that carved themselves into my heart like names on a tombstone. Embarrassing. That was the word my son, the child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through fevers, cheered at baseball games, put through college with money John and I saved quarter by quarter, chose to describe me. His mother had become an embarrassment to him. My hand began to shake, the phone trembling between my fingers like a leaf in a Michigan winter wind. I set it down carefully on the table, next to my Bible, and stared at both objects as if they might explain to me how the world had suddenly tilted off its axis. The apartment fell silent around me, not the peaceful quiet of prayer or meditation, but the hollow silence of abandonment. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere outside, children were laughing as they played in the March sunshine, their voices carrying the joy I used to feel when Tyler was small and I was his whole world. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. The face staring back was lined with 67 years of laughter and tears, crowned with gray hair that I kept neat and styled even though no one seemed to notice anymore. My eyes, once bright with hope and purpose, looked tired. When had I become someone worth being ashamed of? I returned to the kitchen table, picked up my phone, and stared at Tyler's message again. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, composing and deleting responses that ranged from hurt to angry to pleading. But what was there to say? How do you argue with someone who finds your love embarrassing? Instead, I closed the phone and opened my Bible to a passage that had comforted me through John's illness and death. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you, from 1 Peter. But today, the words felt hollow, like empty promises echoing in a deserted church. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the foot of my bed, the same bed where John and I had whispered prayers together every night, holding my worn Bible in hands that felt foreign to me now. I turned pages without reading, looking for something, a verse, a promise, a sign that God was still paying attention to the heart he had created. The silence in my apartment was loud, deafening in its completeness. No husband breathing beside me, no grandchild's laughter filling the rooms, no son calling to check on his aging mother. Just me and the echoes of a life that had somehow become too small, too quiet, too easily forgotten. I had sold our family home 3 years earlier, after John's funeral expenses ate through our savings, and the mortgage became impossible to manage on my widow's Social Security. The real estate agent had been kind but efficient, explaining how the market worked, how I could downsize and simplify my life. What she hadn't explained was how selling the house where I'd raised my son would feel like erasing my own history, painting over the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where I'd measured Tyler's growth year after year. I moved to this small apartment complex in Traverse City, specifically to be closer to Tyler and his growing family. 20 minutes away instead of 2 hours. Close enough to babysit when they needed me, to bring soup when someone was sick, to be the grandmother I had dreamed of being since the day I learned Tyler was engaged. But proximity, I discovered, doesn't guarantee closeness. 20 minutes might as well be 20,000 miles when your phone never rings, when your son's life unfolds on social media like a television show you're not invited to join. Every year, I sent handmade cards. Every year, I watched his wife post pictures of holiday dinners I was never invited to. The memory of Tyler's message haunted me through the sleepless nights that followed. I found myself replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few years, searching for clues I might have missed, signs that I was becoming a burden instead of a blessing in his life. I remembered the countless times I had dropped everything to help when they needed me. Last Christmas, when little Emma caught pneumonia and Tyler's wife Sarah had to work, I spent 3 days and nights at their house, holding that precious baby while she struggled to breathe, whispering prayers over her fevered body, barely sleeping myself. I made homemade chicken soup, did their laundry, cleaned their kitchen, and when Emma finally turned the corner, Sarah simply said, "Thanks, Sharon. We've got it from here." No invitation to stay for dinner. No suggestion that I should be there when Emma took her first steps 2 weeks later. I only knew about it because I saw the video Sarah posted online, tagged with friends and family members whose names I didn't recognize. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't mentioned. I was just the unpaid babysitter who could be dismissed when the crisis passed. I sat in my small living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life devoted to loving people who seemed to have forgotten I existed. On my coffee table lay a stack of birthday cards I had carefully chosen and mailed over the years. Cards for Tyler, Sarah, and baby Emma. Each one contained a handwritten note expressing my love and pride, along with whatever modest check I could afford on my fixed income. The responses had grown shorter and more perfunctory over time, evolving from phone calls to text messages to eventually just a generic thanks with a thumbs-up emoji. My walls were covered with photographs from happier times. Tyler's first day of school, when he clung to my leg and made me promise to pick him up early. His high school graduation, where he thanked me in his speech for being the best mom a guy could ask for. His wedding day when he danced with me to In My Daughter's Eyes and whispered, "I love you, Mom. You're my hero." In that moment, I thought I had succeeded. I thought I had raised a son who would never forget the woman who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. But people change. Life gets complicated. And sometimes, the love that once felt infinite starts to feel like an obligation, a reminder of dependence that grown children would rather forget. I walked to my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser, where I kept my most precious possessions. Beneath folded scarves and costume jewelry lay a small wooden box that John had made for me during our first year of marriage. Inside were Tyler's baby teeth, each one carefully preserved in a tiny envelope marked with the date he lost it. His first report card, with the teacher's note praising his kindness and intelligence. A Father's Day card he made me when he was 8. Yes, Father's Day, because he said I was both his mom and dad when John was working long hours at the lumber mill. The card was construction paper decorated with crayon drawings of flowers and stick figures. In his careful second-grade handwriting, he had written, "Dear Mom, you are the best mom in the world. You make the best cookies, and you read me stories, and you never get mad even when I'm bad. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love, Tyler." I held that card to my chest and felt something break inside me. When had I stopped being worth that kind of love? When had my son's heart grown so distant that my public expressions of pride became sources of shame? I knelt beside my bed, my arthritic knees protesting against the hardwood floor, and folded my hands in prayer. This was the position I had assumed every night for the past 3 years, pleading with God to soften my son's heart, to help him remember the bond we once shared. "Lord Jesus," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "I don't understand what I've done wrong. I loved him the way you love us, unconditionally, sacrificially, without keeping score. I gave him everything I had to give. I supported his dreams, celebrated his achievements, held him when he cried, and cheered him on when he succeeded. I thought that was what mothers were supposed to do." The words spilled out of me like water from a broken dam. I moved away from the home John and I built together, away from the garden I planted and the neighbors who knew me, just so I could be closer to Tyler and his family. I thought proximity would mean presence in their lives. I thought being available would mean being wanted. I paused, listening for some sign that God was hearing my prayer, some whisper of comfort or guidance. But the apartment remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional voices of neighbors whose families visited them regularly. Am I being tested or just forgotten? I asked the question that had been burning in my heart for months. Is this part of your plan, Lord? Or have I somehow failed as a mother? Have I loved too much? Have I given too freely? Have I embarrassed you too? The way I apparently embarrass my son. I thought about the Sunday mornings when Tyler was growing up, how we would sit together in the third pew at Traverse City Community Church, sharing a hymnal, and listening to Pastor Williams preach about the importance of honoring your father and mother. Tyler would fidget during the long sermons, and I would quietly give him mints or let him draw on the margins of the bulletin. He seemed to absorb those lessons about family and faith and love, and I believed they would guide him throughout his life. Now I wondered if those teachings had been as temporary as his childhood, something he had outgrown along with his need for bedtime stories and goodnight kisses. I remembered the day he graduated from Michigan State University with his business degree. John and I had saved for years to help pay his tuition, forgoing vacations and new cars and home improvements so that our son could have opportunities we never had. When Tyler walked across that stage, I cried tears of joy and pride, believing that his success would honor the sacrifices we had made. At the graduation party, Tyler had made a speech thanking his parents for their support. He talked about our work ethic, our values, our unwavering belief in his potential. He called us his heroes and role models, and everyone applauded. I felt like the luckiest mother in the world, but success, I learned, can be a double-edged sword. As Tyler climbed the corporate ladder and built his own life, he seemed to need us less and less. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then occasional. Our invitations to visit were politely declined due to busy schedules and prior commitments. Our offers to help with the baby were accepted only when no other options were available. I began to feel like a safety net that was no longer needed, stored away in some forgotten corner until an emergency arose. The worst part was watching Tyler's wife, Sarah, gradually edit me out of their family narrative. She posted constantly on social media about their lives, their travels, their celebrations. She shared photos of Emma with her own parents, who lived in California but visited frequently. She posted pictures of elaborate birthday parties and holiday gatherings where I was notably absent. When I gently asked Tyler why I wasn't invited to Emma's first birthday party, he seemed genuinely surprised by the question. It was just a small thing. he said, as if my absence was so natural it didn't require explanation. Sarah's parents were in town, and you know how overwhelming big groups can be for babies. But I had seen the photos. 23 people attended that small party. Friends from work, neighbors, college buddies, Sarah's extended family. Everyone except the woman who had prayed for that child before she was even conceived, who had spent sleepless nights caring for her when she was sick, who loved her with the fierce devotion that only grandmothers understand. I started to feel like a ghost in my own family's life, present but unseen, loving but unloved, needed but unwanted. My prayers became more desperate, more pleading. I asked God to change Tyler's heart, to help him remember the love we once shared. I asked for wisdom to understand what I had done wrong and strength to fix whatever was broken between us. I asked for patience to endure the loneliness and faith to believe that this season of separation would eventually end. But months passed, and nothing changed. If anything, the distance seemed to grow wider. Tyler's responses to my calls became shorter and less frequent. My invitations to visit were met with vague promises to try to find time soon. My offers to babysit were declined in favor of paid sitters who didn't expect emotional connection in return for their service. I began to wonder if God had stopped listening to my prayers, if my requests had become as tiresome to him as my love apparently was to my son. The silence from heaven felt as crushing as the silence from Tyler, and I started to question everything I had believed about faith, family, and the promises God makes to those who love him. Late at night, I would lie in bed and replay every conversation, every gesture, every moment of awkwardness or misunderstanding. I analyzed my words, my tone, my timing, searching for the fatal flaw that had transformed me from beloved mother to embarrassing burden. Maybe I had been too involved. Maybe I had offered too much help, expressed too much love, cared too deeply about things that no longer concerned me. Maybe modern motherhood required a different kind of distance, a cooler kind of affection that didn't embarrass grown children or make them uncomfortable. But how do you stop loving someone you carried in your womb for 9 months? How do you turn off the maternal instinct that has guided every decision you've made for nearly 3 decades? How do you become less of a mother when being a mother has been your greatest joy and deepest purpose? I couldn't find the answers in prayer, in scripture, or in the depths of my own heart. All I could do was continue to love and hope and wait, trusting that somehow, someday, the son I had raised would remember the woman who had given him life and devoted her own life to his happiness. But with each passing day, that hope grew dimmer, and I began to wonder if I was praying for a miracle that God had no intention of granting. March 15th, my 68th birthday. I baked myself a lemon cake at 5 in the morning, before the sun had even considered rising over Lake Michigan. John always used to bake that exact cake for me. 3 layers with cream cheese frosting and thin lemon slices arranged like flower petals on top. My hands shook as I measured the flour. Not from age, but from the crushing weight of pretending that this day might somehow be different from all the others. I had been awake since 2:30, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence that had become my constant companion. In the darkness, I had whispered the same prayer I'd been offering for months. Lord, just let him remember. Just let Tyler call today. Let him remember that this is the day his mother was born. The day I became the woman who would love him more than her own life. But dawn broke gray and cold, and my phone remained as silent as a tomb. I decorated the cake with trembling hands, trying to recreate the delicate rosettes John used to pipe with such precision. My attempts looked clumsy and amateurish, but I persisted because the alternative, accepting that no one would celebrate my existence, felt like giving up on life itself. I placed a single white candle in the center, the kind churches use during Advent services, and set the cake on my small dining table next to the window where I could watch the world wake up around me. At 7 o'clock, I called the cemetery where John rested. The groundskeeper, a kind man named Miguel who had known me for 3 years, answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Foster," he said warmly, "how are you this morning?" "It's my birthday, Miguel," I said, surprised by how small my voice sounded. I was wondering, could you put some fresh flowers on John's grave today? Daffodils, if you have them. They were his favorite. "Of course," Miguel replied gently. "And Mrs. Foster?" Happy birthday. I'll say a prayer for you at morning mass. I thanked him and hung up, tears streaming down my face because a stranger had shown me more kindness than my own flesh and blood. By 9 o'clock, I had checked my phone 17 times. No missed calls, no text messages, no birthday wishes from the son I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, and supported through every triumph and failure of his life. I walked to my mailbox, hoping against hope that maybe Tyler had sent a card, that maybe technology hadn't completely replaced the simple gestures of love I had taught him as a child. The metal box contained only bills and advertisements, nothing with my son's handwriting, nothing that acknowledged I had lived another year on this earth. At 10:30, I drove to Traverse City Community Church for the Wednesday morning Bible study I had attended faithfully for 2 years. The parking lot was nearly empty, only 5 cars scattered across the asphalt like seeds that had failed to take root. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering the courage to walk inside and pretend that my heart wasn't breaking. The study was led by Pastor Williams, a man in his 70s who had shepherded this congregation for over 30 years. He was teaching from the book of Job, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who had lost everything, his children, his wealth, his health, yet still praised God in his suffering. Sometimes, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent counseling broken souls, God's silence isn't rejection. Sometimes it's preparation. Sometimes he's working behind the scenes in ways we can't see or understand. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to find comfort in the familiar words about God's mysterious ways and perfect timing. But sitting there in that half-empty room, surrounded by people who had families waiting for them at home, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. After the study, I lingered, hoping someone might ask about my day, might notice that I seemed particularly fragile. But the other attendees gathered their Bibles and purses and hurried off to lunch dates and grandchildren's soccer games, and lives full of people who remembered their birthdays. Mrs. Henderson, a widow I had befriended over coffee and prayer requests, paused briefly beside my chair. "Sharon, you look tired, dear. Are you getting enough rest?" "It's my birthday today," I said quietly, testing whether the words would elicit any response. "Oh, how nice," she replied absently, already putting on her coat. "Well, I hope you have a lovely day. I'm meeting my daughter for lunch at the new place downtown." And then she was gone, leaving me sitting alone in the fellowship hall that smelled of coffee and old hymnals and broken dreams. I drove home slowly, taking the long route past the elementary school where Tyler had once attended, past the park where we used to feed ducks on Saturday mornings, past the ice cream shop where I had taken him for birthday treats when money was tight, but love was abundant. Every landmark mocked me with memories of a time when being his mother felt like the most important job in the world. At home, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the birthday cake that had never been cut, the candle that had never been lit. My phone lay beside it like an accusation, its black screen reflecting my face back at me, a woman grown old and forgotten, invisible even to the child she had devoted her life to loving. I picked up the phone and scrolled through Tyler's social media, a masochistic ritual I had developed over the past few months. His latest post was a photo of himself and Sarah at some upscale restaurant, raising champagne glasses and smiling for the camera. The caption read, "Date night. Finally got a babysitter so we could celebrate making it through another crazy week. Blessed married life." 43 people had liked the post. 27 had left comments about how cute they looked together and how they deserved a night out. Not one person asked who was watching Emma. Not one person wondered if the grandmother who lived 20 minutes away might have been available to babysit. I scrolled down further and found photos from the previous weekend. Tyler pushing Emma on a swing at the park, Sarah holding the baby while walking through downtown. Multi-generational images featuring Sarah's parents who had apparently visited again without my knowledge. In every photo, Emma looked happy and loved, surrounded by people who claimed her as their own. Except me. Always except me. I set the phone down and walked to my bathroom mirror, the same mirror where I had been confronting my aging reflection for 3 years. The face staring back looked older than its 68 years, marked by sleepless nights and constant worry and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who doesn't love you back. When had I become so easy to forget? When had my existence become so insignificant that my own son couldn't be bothered to acknowledge the day I was born? I returned to the kitchen and lit the candle on my birthday cake, watching its small flame flicker in the afternoon light streaming through the window. The silence in my apartment felt profound, almost sacred in its completeness. No husband to sing "Happy Birthday" off-key, no grandchild to giggle and clap, no son to call and express gratitude for the woman who had given him life. "Happy birthday to me," I whispered to the empty room. "Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear Sharon. Happy birthday to me." My voice cracked on the last word, and I began to cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, ugly sobs of a woman whose heart was finally acknowledging what her mind had been trying to deny for months. I was utterly, completely alone in the world. The people I loved most had moved on without me, and I had been too proud or too stubborn or too desperate to accept that reality. I blew out the candle and made a wish that felt more like a prayer. "Please, God, either bring my son back to me or take away this pain that's killing me slowly." That evening, as darkness settled over Traverse City like a heavy blanket, I did something I had never done before. I turned off my phone. I unplugged the landline John had insisted we keep for emergencies. I severed every connection to the outside world and sat in the silence that had become my unwelcome companion. If Tyler decided to call, if somehow, miraculously, he remembered that this was the day his mother was born, he would reach voicemail. He would know what it felt like to have his attempts at connection go unanswered. He would experience, for just a moment, the crushing silence that had become the soundtrack of my life. But even as I sat in that self-imposed isolation, I knew Tyler wouldn't call. I knew he had forgotten, the same way he had forgotten so many other things that once mattered to him, the same way he had forgotten the woman who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. I opened my Bible to Psalm 88, the one psalm that offered no hope, no promise of divine intervention, no assurance that suffering would eventually be transformed into joy. It was the psalm of abandonment, of divine silence, of a soul crying out to God and receiving no answer. "Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out before you day and night," I read aloud, my voice echoing in the empty apartment. "May my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol." For the first time in my life, I understood the psalmist's despair. For the first time, I wondered if God, too, had turned his face away from me. If perhaps my prayers had become as tiresome to him as my love apparently was to my son. I closed the Bible and sat in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of expectations that would never be fulfilled, holding on to a faith that felt increasingly fragile in my trembling hands. Outside my window, the world continued its relentless march forward. Families gathered for dinner. Children called their mothers. Grandparents tucked grandchildren into bed with stories and kisses and promises of tomorrow. But inside my small apartment, time seemed suspended, trapped between the hope that had sustained me for 68 years and the despair that threatened to consume whatever time I had left. I was 68 years old, and I had never felt more invisible, more forgotten, more utterly alone in a world that had somehow forgotten I existed at all. 3 weeks after my forgotten birthday, my knees gave out on me. It was a Tuesday morning in early April, when the Michigan spring still carried winter's bite, and the sidewalks remained treacherous with patches of ice that refused to surrender to the warming sun. I had been walking back from Meijer with 2 bags of groceries. Nothing heavy, just the essentials an elderly woman living alone requires to sustain herself through another week of solitude. The bags contained the same items I purchased every Tuesday: a loaf of bread that would last me 10 days, a small carton of milk, eggs I would stretch into 3 different meals, and a frozen dinner for the nights when cooking for one felt too depressing to attempt. I had learned to shop efficiently, calculating portions for a household of 1, trying not to remember the days when I filled an entire cart to feed a family who actually wanted to share meals together. As I approached the entrance to my apartment complex, my right knee simply buckled. There was no warning, no gradual weakening, One moment I was walking normally, and the next I was sprawling across the cold concrete, my groceries scattered around me like the remnants of dignity I could no longer maintain. The milk carton split open, its contents spreading across the sidewalk in a white puddle that reflected the gray April sky. Eggs cracked and leaked, their golden yolks mixing with the milk to create a mess that somehow perfectly represented the state of my life. The bread had landed in a small patch of dirty snow, its wrapper torn and the contents probably ruined. I lay there for a moment, more stunned than hurt, staring up at the clouds and wondering if this was how my story would end. Alone on a sidewalk, surrounded by the basic necessities of survival, with no one to witness my fall or help me get back up. My left hip throbbed where it had struck the concrete, and I could feel moisture seeping through my coat where the spilled milk had reached me. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of being so completely helpless, so utterly without resources or support. I tried to push myself up, but my hand slipped on the wet pavement, and I fell back down with a small cry that echoed off the brick walls of the apartment complex. A car drove past without slowing down. A woman walking her dog across the street looked in my direction, but continued on her way, either not seeing my predicament or choosing not to get involved. For nearly 10 minutes, I remained on that sidewalk, gathering the strength and courage to try again. During those minutes, I prayed, not the desperate pleas for divine intervention that had become my nightly ritual, but simple, practical requests for the ability to stand up and walk to my door without further injury. "Please, Lord," I whispered, my breath visible in the cold air. "Just help me get home. Just give me enough strength to make it inside where I can fall apart in private." Finally, a man emerged from the building next to mine, someone I had seen in passing but never spoken to. He was perhaps 50 years old, wearing work clothes and carrying a lunch cooler, clearly heading to his job. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, jogging over with genuine concern in his voice. "I saw you from my window. Did you fall?" His name was David, I learned later, and he worked construction despite having back problems that made lifting difficult. But he helped me to my feet with gentle hands, gathered my scattered groceries, and insisted on walking me to my door to make sure I made it safely inside. "Do you have someone I can call?" he asked as I fumbled with my keys. "Family member? Friend? Someone who should know you took a spill?" I paused, my hand trembling on the door handle. The honest answer was no. I had no one to call. No emergency contact who would rush to my aid. No person in this world who would be alarmed by news of my injury. But admitting that truth to a kind stranger felt like the final acknowledgement of how completely I had failed at the basic human task of maintaining meaningful relationships. "My son," I said finally, the lie bitter on my tongue. "I'll call my son." David nodded and waited until I was safely inside before heading to his own responsibilities. Through my window, I watched him walk to his truck, probably already putting our encounter behind him as he mentally prepared for his workday. He had shown me more genuine concern in 10 minutes than my own family had demonstrated in months. I sat on my couch, still wearing my damp coat, and stared at my phone for nearly an hour before finally composing a text message to Tyler. "I fell today outside my apartment. Just wanted to let you know I'm okay. Bruised my hip and spilled my groceries, but nothing serious." I typed and deleted that message 3 times, each version sounding either too dramatic or too dismissive. I didn't want to worry him unnecessarily, but I also didn't want to pretend that being alone and helpless hadn't scared me more than the physical fall itself. Finally, I settled on something simple. "Took a little tumble today, but I'm fine. Hope you and the family are well." I sent the message at 11:47 a.m., and then waited, checking my phone every few minutes for a response that would indicate Tyler cared about his mother's welfare. Lunchtime came and went. The afternoon stretched into evening. My hip stiffened and the bruising spread, painting my side in shades of purple and yellow that reminded me of the Easter flowers John used to plant in our garden. Tyler's response arrived at 8:23 p.m., nearly 9 hours after I had reached out to him. One emoji, a thumbs-up symbol that somehow managed to convey complete indifference to his mother's situation. Not, "Are you hurt?" Not, "Do you need help?" Not, "Should I come check on you?" Just a digital symbol that required no thought, no emotion, No acknowledgement that the woman who had given him life was aging and vulnerable and increasingly alone in the world. I stared at that emoji until my vision blurred with tears, understanding with perfect clarity that if I had been seriously injured, if I had been lying unconscious on that sidewalk for hours, Tyler would not have been alarmed by my silence. He had become so accustomed to our infrequent communication that my absence from his life wouldn't register as unusual or concerning. That night, I lay in bed with an ice pack pressed against my bruised hip and confronted a truth I had been avoiding for months. If I died tomorrow, my son wouldn't notice until someone official called him about my affairs. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it brought a strange kind of clarity. I had been living my life as if Tyler's love was still available to me, as if our relationship was simply going through a difficult phase that would eventually resolve itself. I had been operating under the assumption that my devoted mothering would eventually be recognized and appreciated, that the sacrifices I had made would someday be acknowledged and valued. But lying there in the darkness, my body aching from the fall and my heart aching from Tyler's indifference, I realized I had been clinging to an illusion. The son I had raised, the boy who had once needed me desperately and loved me completely, had grown into a man who found my existence inconvenient at best and embarrassing at worst. I was not a beloved mother temporarily separated from her child. I was not a cherished grandmother whose presence was eagerly anticipated. I was not even a respected elder whose wisdom and experience were valued by younger generations. I was simply a woman who had outlived her usefulness, whose love had become a burden rather than a blessing, whose continued existence served no purpose in the lives of the people she cared about most. The next morning, I woke with a different kind of resolve. The physical pain from my fall had subsided to a manageable ache, but something deeper had shifted during my sleepless night of self-examination. For the first time in months, I didn't reach for my phone to check if Tyler had sent any follow-up messages about my welfare. I didn't compose hopeful texts designed to elicit responses that would never come. Instead, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my Bible, turning to a passage I had avoided for years because it hit too close to home. When my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. Psalm 27:10. The words seemed to leap off the page, speaking directly to my situation with a relevance that felt almost supernatural. Here was acknowledgement that sometimes even the closest family relationships fail, that sometimes people who should love us unconditionally choose to abandon us instead. But the verse also contained a promise that when human love fails, divine love remains constant. I had been so focused on trying to repair my relationship with Tyler, so desperate to regain his affection and attention, that I had forgotten the relationship that was still available to me. I had been pouring all my emotional energy into a connection that no longer existed while neglecting the one relationship that had never wavered, never disappointed, never left me feeling worthless or forgotten. For the first time in months, I prayed not for Tyler's heart to change, but for my own strength to accept what I could not control. I asked not for divine intervention in my family relationships, but for wisdom to understand my purpose and value independent of other people's recognition. Lord, I whispered, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup for warmth, I've been asking you to change my son's heart, but maybe what needs to change is my understanding of where my worth comes from. Maybe what needs to change is my willingness to accept love from you, even when human love fails me. The prayer felt different from all the desperate pleas I had offered over the past months. It carried less desperation and more acceptance, less begging, and more surrender. It was the prayer of a woman who was finally ready to stop trying to force love from people who had chosen not to give it and start receiving love from the one who had never stopped offering it. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since moving to the apartment. I explored my neighborhood, not rushing to accomplish errands or hurrying back to wait for phone calls that wouldn't come, but simply walking slowly and observing the world around me with new eyes. I discovered a small park 3 blocks from my building, complete with benches and a pond where ducks gathered to beg for breadcrumbs from visitors. I sat on one of the benches and watched an elderly man feed the ducks while his granddaughter laughed and clapped at their antics. The scene should have made me sad, should have reminded me of everything I was missing with Emma. Instead, I found myself smiling at the child's joy, appreciating the beauty of the moment without needing to possess it or be included in it. I walked past houses where families were beginning their evening routines. Children playing in yards while parents prepared dinner, teenagers walking dogs and talking on phones, couples working together in gardens that showed the promise of spring's return. These glimpses of ordinary family life no longer felt like accusations against my own solitude. They simply were what they were. Other people living their own stories, facing their own challenges, finding their own ways to create meaning and connection. By the time I returned to my apartment, something had shifted in my perspective. The silence that had felt oppressive now seemed peaceful. The solitude that had felt like punishment now seemed like an opportunity for self-discovery. The independence that had felt like abandonment now seemed like a chance to remember who I was beyond my roles as wife, mother, and grandmother. I was still Sharon Foster, the woman who had raised a successful son and loved a devoted husband and contributed to her community in countless ways. I was still the woman who knew how to comfort crying babies and bake birthday cakes and offer prayers for people in need. I was still the woman who had survived loss and disappointment and heartbreak, who had found ways to keep going when staying in bed seemed like the only rational option. Tyler's indifference couldn't erase those truths about who I was. His embarrassment couldn't diminish the value of the love I had given so freely. His silence couldn't invalidate the decades of devotion I had poured into his life. I was learning, slowly and painfully, that my worth didn't depend on other people's recognition of it. My value wasn't determined by whether my son appreciated my sacrifices or welcomed my presence in his life. My identity wasn't tied to roles that other people might decide I was no longer qualified to fill. I was a child of God, created for purposes that extended far beyond the narrow confines of family relationships that had grown toxic through neglect and indifference. I was a woman with gifts to offer, wisdom to share, and love to give, even if the people I had been offering those gifts to had decided they no longer wanted them. The fall on the sidewalk had broken more than just my hip. It had shattered the illusions I had been carrying about my place in Tyler's life, and forced me to confront the reality of my situation. But sometimes things need to be broken before they can be rebuilt in stronger, more authentic ways. I was ready to start rebuilding. 2 weeks after my fall, Tyler called me for the first time in over a month. It was a Thursday evening in late April, and I was sitting in my living room reading Jesus Calling by Sarah Young, a devotional book that had become my constant companion during these difficult months. The familiar weight of the book in my hands brought comfort, its daily messages serving as reminders that I was not as alone as I sometimes felt. When my phone rang, my heart jumped the way it always did when Tyler's name appeared on the screen. Despite everything, despite the indifference and the silence and the crushing disappointment, some foolish part of me still hoped that each call might be the one where he remembered who I used to be to him. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of distracted efficiency that had become familiar over the past few years. I could hear Emma babbling in the background, and Sarah's voice discussing something about dinner plans. "Tyler," I said, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. "How are you, sweetheart? How's the baby?" "Yeah, we're good," he replied, clearly multitasking while we spoke. "Listen, I've got a huge favor to ask. Sarah's mom is in the hospital. Nothing serious, just some routine surgery. But Sarah needs to fly out to San Diego to help her dad for a week. And I've got this massive project deadline at work that's going to require some serious overtime." My heart began to sink as I realized this wasn't a call to check on my welfare or express concern about my fall. This was Tyler reaching out because he needed something from me, the same pattern that had defined our relationship for the past 3 years. "We were wondering if you could watch Emma for us," he continued. "I know it's short notice, but we're really in a bind here. She's been sleeping through the night lately, so it shouldn't be too difficult. And we'd really appreciate it." I sat in silence for a moment, holding the phone while something inside me wrestled with competing impulses. The old Sharon, the woman who had spent 68 years saying yes to every request, who had defined her worth through her usefulness to others, wanted to immediately agree. Here was Tyler, finally needing me, finally acknowledging that I had value in his life. But something had changed since my fall on the sidewalk. The woman who had spent sleepless nights analyzing every interaction, who had tortured herself with questions about what she had done wrong, was being replaced by someone clearer-eyed and more self-aware. When would this be? I asked carefully. This weekend, Tyler said, and I could hear the assumption in his voice that I would naturally be available, that my calendar would be empty and my schedule completely flexible. Sarah's flying out Saturday morning and I'll be pulling long hours all week. We figured Emma could stay at your place. It might be easier than me trying to manage my work schedule and her routine. A week. He was asking me to provide full-time childcare for a week, with 3 days' notice, during a period when I was still recovering from my fall and dealing with the emotional aftermath of months of being treated like an inconvenience. I don't know, Tyler, I heard myself say, the words coming out before I could stop them. I'm still pretty sore from my fall, and watching a toddler for a full week, that's a lot for someone my age. Come on, Mom, he said, and I could hear the irritation creeping into his voice. You're not that old. And Emma's really easy. She basically just needs someone to keep an eye on her and make sure she doesn't get into trouble. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Tyler had asked me to babysit because he wanted to spend time with me and Emma together, rather than because he needed free childcare. I couldn't recall a single instance. Every request had been transactional. Tyler needed something. I provided it. And then I was dismissed until the next crisis arose. What about the babysitter you usually use? I asked. The one you hired for your date nights? She's not available for extended periods, Tyler replied, his tone growing more impatient. Look, I thought you'd be happy to spend time with your granddaughter. I thought you wanted to be more involved in Emma's life. The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. He was suggesting that my hesitation to provide emergency childcare was evidence that I didn't truly want a relationship with Emma, that I was somehow failing as a grandmother by not immediately jumping at the opportunity to serve his needs. For so many years, that kind of emotional manipulation would have worked. I would have felt guilty for even considering saying no, would have convinced myself that this was my chance to prove my devotion and earn my way back into Tyler's good graces. But something had broken in me during those hours on the sidewalk, something that had been rebuilt with stronger materials and clearer foundations. I was learning to distinguish between genuine love and desperate need, between healthy relationships and exploitative ones. I do want to be involved in Emma's life, I said quietly, but I want to be involved as her grandmother, not as your free babysitting service. I want to be invited to birthday parties and family dinners and quiet afternoons where we can just enjoy each other's company. I want to be included in the ordinary moments of her childhood, not just summoned when you need someone to solve a problem. Tyler was quiet for a moment, and I could hear Sarah's voice in the background asking about the arrangements. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something colder and more distant. I can't believe you're being so selfish about this, he said. This is your granddaughter we're talking about. Sarah's mom is in the hospital, and you're worried about being a little tired. I'm not being selfish, I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'm being honest about my limitations and my needs. I'm 68 years old, Tyler. I'm recovering from a fall that left me bruised and shaken. I live alone in a small apartment that isn't child-proofed for a toddler. And frankly, I'm hurt that you only call me when you need something. That's not true, Tyler protested. But even he seemed to hear the weakness in his own argument. I call you. You called me 3 times in the past 6 months, I said, the numbers clear in my mind because I had counted each precious conversation. Once to ask me to babysit when Emma was sick. Once to see if I could drive to your house and wait for a repairman. And now this. You didn't call me on my birthday, Tyler. You didn't call me after I told you I fell. You responded to news of my injury with an emoji. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to hear Emma's laughter in the background, the sound of my granddaughter's joy serving as a painful reminder of all the moments I was missing in her life. Look, I don't want to argue about this, Tyler finally said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was already mentally moving on to other solutions. If you can't help us, we'll figure something else out. I can help you, I said, the words coming out in a rush because I suddenly understood what I needed to say. I can help you find a qualified babysitter. I can help you research childcare options. I can help you create a support system that doesn't depend on treating your mother like an employee you don't have to pay. What's that supposed to mean? It means I love you and Emma more than you know, I said, tears beginning to fall as I spoke words I had never been brave enough to say before. But I won't be taken for granted anymore. I won't be ignored until you need me, and then dismissed as soon as the crisis passes. I won't be treated like my time has no value just because I'm retired and alone. Mom, you're being ridiculous, Tyler said. But I could hear uncertainty in his voice now, as if he was beginning to recognize that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. I'm being honest, I corrected. For the first time in years, I'm being completely honest about how your treatment of me makes me feel. And I'm telling you that I need our relationship to change if it's going to continue. Fine, Tyler said, his voice sharp with frustration. We'll find someone else. But I think you're going to regret this, Mom. I think you're going to realize that you're choosing to be alone when you could be helping your family. The call ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in my living room with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and trying to process what had just happened. I had said no to my son for the first time in his adult life. I had refused to be treated as a convenient solution to his problems rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. I had chosen my own dignity over his approval, my own well-being over his convenience. The aftermath felt strange and disorienting. Part of me wanted to call Tyler back immediately, to apologize and offer to take Emma for the week regardless of my own needs. The patterns of a lifetime don't disappear overnight, and the impulse to please and serve and sacrifice felt as natural as breathing. But a stronger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The constant anxiety about Tyler's approval, the endless worry about whether I was doing enough to maintain his affection, the exhausting effort to prove my worth through my usefulness, all of it had lifted, at least temporarily. I opened my devotional book and read the passage for that day. I am teaching you to find your completeness in me alone. All your needs, emotional, spiritual, and physical, can be satisfied through your relationship with me. The words seemed to speak directly to my situation. I had been trying to find my completeness in Tyler's approval, in his need for me, in his acknowledgement of my love. I had been pouring all my emotional energy into a relationship that couldn't possibly bear the weight of my desperate need for validation and connection. But God's love wasn't conditional on my usefulness. His acceptance didn't depend on my ability to solve other people's problems or sacrifice my own needs for their convenience. His relationship with me was based on grace rather than performance, on love rather than transaction. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I cooked myself a proper dinner, not a frozen meal or a can of soup, but an actual meal with vegetables and protein and care. I set the table with my good china, the dishes I had been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come. I lit a candle and played soft music and treated myself like someone worth celebrating. As I ate, I reflected on the conversation with Tyler and felt a complex mixture of emotions. I was sad that our relationship had reached this point, disappointed that he seemed incapable of seeing me as anything more than a resource to be exploited. I was worried about the future of our connection and concerned about my relationship with Emma. But I was also proud of myself for finally setting boundaries, for refusing to accept treatment that diminished my worth and dignity. I was relieved to have stopped pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I was hopeful that this moment of honesty might eventually lead to a healthier dynamic between us. Most importantly, I was beginning to remember who I was beyond my roles as mother and grandmother. I was Sharon Foster, a woman with her own interests and needs and dreams. I was someone who deserved to be treated with respect and consideration, not because of what I could do for others, but because of my inherent worth as a human being created in God's image. For the first time in years, I went to bed feeling peaceful rather than anxious. I had chosen myself over someone else's convenience, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had begun to look a little brighter, a little more full of possibility. I was learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their selfish behavior. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give is to refuse to be taken for granted. Sometimes the most faithful response to mistreatment is to trust that God values you enough to deserve better. I was 68 years old, and I was finally learning to say no. It was the first word of a new vocabulary I was building, a language of self-respect and boundaries and healthy relationships that would serve me well in whatever time I had left on this earth. Tomorrow, Tyler would have to find another solution to his childcare problem, and I would have to figure out how to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for crumbs of affection from people who had forgotten how to love me properly. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had finally found the courage to value herself enough to demand the respect she deserved. And that felt like a very good place to start. 3 days after I said no to Tyler, Sarah called me herself. It was Sunday evening, and I had just returned from the most peaceful church service I'd attended in months. Pastor Williams had preached about the woman at the well, about how Jesus saw her worth when everyone else saw only her failures. I felt like that woman, finally beginning to see myself through God's eyes rather than through the lens of other people's disappointment. Sarah's name appeared on my phone screen like a storm cloud on a clear day. She rarely called me directly, preferring to communicate through Tyler, or not at all. When she did speak to me, it was usually with the polite distance of someone fulfilling an obligation, rather than nurturing a relationship. "Sharon," she said when I answered, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "We need to talk." I settled into my favorite chair, the one by the window where I could see the small garden the apartment complex maintained. The tulips were beginning to bloom, their bright colors a reminder that beauty could emerge even after the harshest winters. "Hello, Sarah," I replied calmly. "How is your mother doing?" "She's fine," Sarah said dismissively, clearly not interested in pleasantries. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but your selfishness has put our entire family in a terrible position. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to find reliable childcare on short notice?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but I had been preparing for this moment since Thursday evening. I had prayed about it, thought about it, and steeled myself for the inevitable backlash that comes when you stop being endlessly accommodating to people who have grown comfortable taking advantage of your generosity. "I'm not playing any games," I said quietly. "I simply told Tyler that I couldn't provide full-time childcare for a week on 3 days' notice. I explained that I'm still recovering from my fall and that I have my own limitations." "Your fall?" Sarah's voice dripped with disbelief. "Tyler said you slipped on some ice. It's not like you broke your leg or something serious. You're using a minor stumble as an excuse to abandon your granddaughter when she needs you most." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, reminding myself of the verses I had been meditating on all week. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." "Emma doesn't need me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Emma needs qualified, reliable childcare from someone who isn't being asked to sacrifice their own well-being for your convenience. She needs parents who plan ahead and don't treat family members like emergency backup plans." "I can't believe how selfish you've become," Sarah continued, her voice rising with indignation. "When my mother was Emma's age, my grandmother would have dropped everything to help us in a situation like this. She understood what family meant, what sacrifice looked like. The comparison stung because it was designed to, but I had learned to recognize manipulation when I heard it. Sarah was trying to shame me into compliance by contrasting me unfavorably with other grandmothers, by suggesting that my refusal to be exploited somehow made me less loving or devoted. "Your grandmother sounds wonderful," I replied. "I'm sure she was a woman who was valued and respected by her family, whose contributions were appreciated rather than taken for granted. I'm sure she was invited to family gatherings and included in important decisions and treated like a cherished member of the family rather than an employee who could be summoned when needed and dismissed when convenient." Sarah was quiet for a moment, perhaps realizing that her comparison had backfired. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from accusatory to manipulative, the way someone might speak to a child who was being unreasonably stubborn. "Sharon, I think you're misunderstanding the situation," she said, her voice artificially sweetened. "We do value you. We appreciate everything you've done for us. But sometimes families have to pull together during difficult times. Sometimes we have to put aside our personal comfort for the good of the people we love." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, surprising her with my ready acceptance of her premise. Families do need to pull together. They need to support each other through difficult times. They need to put aside personal comfort for the good of the people they love. "Exactly," Sarah said, clearly thinking she had won the argument. So when will you be inviting me to Emma's birthday party next month? I asked. When will you be including me in your holiday celebrations? When will you be calling to check on my welfare, to ask about my health, to show interest in my life beyond my usefulness as a babysitter? Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear Sarah's mental wheels turning as she tried to find a response that didn't acknowledge the fundamental unfairness of their treatment of me. That's different, she finally said. Those are social situations. We're talking about a family emergency. No, I corrected gently. You're talking about a scheduling conflict that you want me to solve by sacrificing my own needs and well-being. Your mother's routine surgery is not a family emergency. Your husband's work deadline is not a crisis that requires me to provide free childcare for a week. These are normal life challenges that every family faces, and most families solve them without exploiting elderly relatives. Tyler was right, Sarah said, her artificial sweetness evaporating into raw anger. You have become incredibly selfish. I don't know what's happened to you, but the woman who raised Tyler would never have abandoned her family like this. The accusation about abandoning my family was particularly cruel because it turned reality completely upside down. I wasn't the one who had withdrawn from family relationships, who had created distance and barriers, who had turned love into a transaction. I was the one who had been abandoned, gradually and systematically excluded from the family I had helped create. You're absolutely right, I said again, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. The woman who raised Tyler would never have abandoned her family. She would have said yes to every request, no matter how unreasonable. She would have accepted every slight, every dismissal, every insult, because she was so desperate for love that she was willing to accept crumbs instead of demanding the full meal she deserved. I paused, looking out my window at the garden where new life was pushing through the soil despite the lingering cold. But that woman was slowly dying inside, I continued. She was sacrificing her health, her dignity, and her self-respect for people who showed her no appreciation or consideration in return. She was enabling behavior that was harmful to everyone involved, including Tyler and Emma. What's that supposed to mean? Sarah demanded. It means that teaching a child that some people exist only to serve others, that some people's needs don't matter as much as their own, is not doing that child any favors, I said. It means that allowing Tyler to treat his mother like hired help is not helping him become the kind of man who knows how to build healthy, reciprocal relationships. You're being ridiculous, Sarah said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. Tyler loves you. We both do. We just need your help right now. If Tyler loves me, when was the last time he expressed that love in a way that didn't involve asking me to do something for him? I asked. When was the last time he called just to talk? Just to see how I was doing? When was the last time he invited me to spend time with Emma for the simple pleasure of being together rather than because he needed childcare? Sarah couldn't answer, and we both knew why. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of truths neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I love Tyler more than my own life, I said finally. I love Emma with a grandmother's fierce devotion, but I won't love either of them by enabling behavior that diminishes all of us. I won't teach Emma that it's acceptable to use people who love you. I won't show Tyler that unconditional love means accepting conditional respect. So what are you saying? Sarah asked, her voice tight with frustration. That you're going to punish Emma because you're angry with us? I'm not punishing anyone, I replied. I'm simply refusing to participate in a dynamic that has become unhealthy for everyone involved. I'm choosing to love Tyler and Emma enough to stop enabling patterns that aren't serving anyone well. This is unbelievable, Sarah said. I'm going to tell Tyler exactly what kind of grandmother you've chosen to be. I'm going to make sure he understands that when his family needed you most, you chose yourself instead. The threat hung in the air like a sword, designed to terrify me into submission. For so many years, the possibility of Tyler's anger, of his further withdrawal from my life, would have been enough to make me capitulate immediately. But I had been learning a different kind of courage over the past few weeks. The kind that comes from knowing your worth doesn't depend on other people's approval. Please do tell Tyler, I said calmly. Tell him that his mother finally learned to value herself enough to expect basic respect and consideration from the people she loves. Tell him that his mother decided to stop accepting treatment that was slowly killing her spirit. Tell him that his mother chose to love him enough to stop enabling behavior that was making him less capable of real intimacy and genuine relationship. I paused, feeling a strange sense of peace descend over me despite the conflict raging through the phone line. And Sarah, I added, please tell him that I forgive him for forgetting who I am, but I won't pretend to be someone less than I am just to make his life more convenient. I won't disappear into the background so he can avoid feeling guilty about how he's treated me. You're going to regret this, Sarah said, her voice venomous now. You're going to end up completely alone, and it will be your own fault. I've been alone for years, I replied quietly. The only difference is that now I'm being honest about it instead of pretending otherwise. At least now my solitude has dignity. Sarah hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me sitting in my chair with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and feeling surprisingly calm despite the storm that had just passed through my evening. I set the phone down and walked to my kitchen, where I made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the small table where I had eaten so many solitary meals. But tonight, the solitude felt different. Instead of the hollow loneliness of abandonment, it felt like the peaceful quiet of someone who had finally stopped fighting battles she couldn't win. I opened my Bible to Philippians 4:19, and my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. The words seemed to glow on the page, reminding me that my deepest needs, for love, for purpose, for dignity, for connection, could be met even when human relationships failed me. Outside my window, the spring evening was settling into darkness, but inside my small apartment, I felt a kind of light I hadn't experienced in years. It was the light of truth acknowledged, of boundaries established, of self-respect reclaimed. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences my honesty had created. Tyler might be angry. Sarah might poison whatever remained of my relationship with Emma. I might find myself even more isolated from the family I had devoted my life to loving. But tonight, I was a woman who had finally learned to speak the truth in love, even when that truth was uncomfortable. I was someone who had chosen her own dignity over other people's convenience, her own well-being over their demands. I was 68 years old, and I was finally learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be treated with contempt. Sometimes the most generous gift you can offer is the example of someone who knows their worth and insists on being treated accordingly. The storm had passed, but I could feel something new beginning to grow in its wake. Not the desperate hope that had sustained me for so long, but something steadier and more sustainable. The quiet confidence of a woman who had finally remembered she was a daughter of the king, worthy of respect and love simply because she existed. Whether Tyler ever remembered that truth about me or not, I would never forget it again. 2 weeks after Sarah's angry phone call, something miraculous happened. I woke up smiling. It wasn't the forced smile I had been wearing for months, like ill-fitting clothing, the desperate expression of someone trying to convince herself that everything was fine when her world was crumbling. This was different. A genuine curve of my lips that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place I had almost forgotten existed. I sat up in bed and looked around my small apartment with new eyes. The morning light streaming through my bedroom window illuminated the same modest furniture, the same walls that had witnessed so many tears and sleepless nights. But somehow, everything looked brighter, more full of possibility. For the first time in years, I felt excited about the day ahead. The past 2 weeks had been a revelation. Without the constant anxiety of waiting for Tyler's calls, without the exhausting effort of trying to prove my worth through my usefulness, I had rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing. I had started attending a Tuesday morning women's Bible study at Traverse City Community Church, led by a remarkable woman named Eleanor Patterson, who was 73 years old and radiated the kind of joy that comes from a life lived in close communion with God. Eleanor had welcomed me with the warmth of someone who recognized a fellow traveler on the difficult journey of aging with grace and purpose. "You know, Sharon," Eleanor had said after our second meeting as we lingered over coffee and homemade blueberry muffins, "sometimes God has to strip away everything we thought we needed in order to show us what we actually need." The other women in the group, ranging in age from 55 to 82, had become an unexpected source of strength and community. Margaret Chen, a retired nurse whose own children lived across the country and rarely visited. Dorothy Williams, a widow whose husband had died 5 years ago and who had learned to travel solo to places they had always planned to visit together. Linda Thompson, whose adult daughter had struggled with addiction and had finally learned that loving someone sometimes meant stepping back and letting them face the consequences of their choices. Each woman had her own story of loss, disappointment, and eventual liberation. Each had discovered that the later chapters of life could be among the most meaningful, if you were brave enough to write them on your own terms rather than according to other people's expectations. I spent 60 years defining myself through my relationships with other people, Dorothy had shared during one particularly honest discussion about identity and purpose. I was somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. When those roles were taken away or became complicated, I didn't know who I was anymore. And now? I had asked, genuinely curious about how someone navigates that kind of existential crisis. Now I'm Dorothy Williams, child of God, created for purposes that go far beyond the ways other people choose to relate to me, she had replied with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought hard battles and emerged victorious. I'm still all those other things too, but they're not the only things. They're not even the most important things. Those conversations had planted seeds in my heart that were beginning to bloom in unexpected ways. I started taking long walks around Traverse City, not rushing to accomplish errands but simply exploring my community with the curiosity of someone seeing it for the first time. I discovered a small bookstore that hosted poetry readings on Thursday evenings, staffed by people who were genuinely interested in literature and conversation. I found a community garden where volunteers were always welcome, where I could dig in the soil and help create beauty without needing anyone's permission or approval. Most surprisingly, I had started volunteering at Grace House, a women's shelter downtown that provided temporary housing and support services for women escaping difficult situations. The director, a compassionate woman named Janet Rodriguez, had been delighted to discover that I had decades of experience managing households, budgeting on limited resources, and providing the kind of practical wisdom that comes from years of solving problems with creativity and determination. We desperately need volunteers who understand what it's like to start over, Janet had explained during my orientation. Women who know that dignity isn't dependent on circumstances, who can offer hope based on their own experience of surviving difficult times. Working with women who were facing homelessness, domestic violence, and financial crisis had given me a perspective on my own situation that was both humbling and liberating. Here were women who had lost everything: their homes, their security, their confidence in their own judgment, yet who were finding ways to rebuild with courage and determination that took my breath away. Maria Santos, a 43-year-old mother who had fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back and her 2 young children, had become particularly dear to me. She was learning English while working toward her GED, supporting her family with part-time jobs that barely covered their basic needs. Yet she greeted each day with gratitude and optimism that shamed my own recent self-pity. "Mrs. Sharon," she said to me one afternoon as we sorted donated clothing in the shelter's resource room, "you are like angel to me. You listen to my problems. You help with my English. You never make me feel small for not knowing things." Her words had moved me to tears because they reminded me of something I had forgotten during the painful months of feeling invisible and unappreciated. I had gifts to offer. I had wisdom earned through decades of experience, compassion deepened by my own suffering, and practical skills that could make a real difference in other people's lives. At Grace House, I wasn't someone's inconvenient mother or embarrassing grandmother. I was Sharon Foster, volunteer coordinator, mentor, friend. I was someone whose presence was welcomed, whose contributions were valued, whose insights were sought and appreciated. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. I helped new residents fill out forms for government assistance, navigate the complex systems of social services, and develop budgets that would allow them to save money for security deposits on permanent housing. I organized clothing drives and coordinated meal preparations, and listened to stories of heartbreak and hope that reminded me daily of the resilience of the human spirit. More importantly, I was building genuine relationships with women who saw me as I actually was, rather than through the filter of their own needs and expectations. These were friendships based on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than obligation or convenience. "You know what I love about you, Sharon?" Eleanor Patterson had said to me after church one Sunday. "You've stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. You've stopped trying to earn love by making yourself smaller and more convenient for other people." She was right. The woman who had spent months analyzing every word of Tyler's text messages, who had tortured herself with questions about what she had done wrong, was being replaced by someone clearer about her own worth and more selective about where she invested her emotional energy. I still prayed for Tyler every night, but my prayers had changed. Instead of begging God to change Tyler's heart toward me, I asked for wisdom to love him well without sacrificing my own dignity. Instead of pleading for reconciliation on any terms, I asked for the strength to maintain healthy boundaries while keeping my heart open to genuine restoration of our relationship. "Lord," I prayed one evening as spring gave way to early summer, "I place Tyler in your hands. I can't control his choices or change his heart, but I can control my own responses. Help me love him the way you love all of us. Unconditionally but not enablingly, faithfully but not foolishly." The freedom that came from releasing control over outcomes I couldn't influence was intoxicating. Instead of spending my days anxiously checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come, I filled my time with activities that brought genuine joy and fulfillment. Instead of measuring my worth by Tyler's level of interest in my life, I began to discover interests and passions that had nothing to do with my family relationships. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but had never made time for when my schedule revolved around other people's needs and crises. My first attempts were clumsy and childlike, but the instructor, a retired art teacher named Frank Morrison, was encouraging and patient. "Art isn't about creating perfection," he told our small class of middle-aged and elderly students. "It's about expressing something true about your experience of the world. It's about paying attention to beauty and trying to capture some small piece of it to share with others." I painted landscapes of Lake Michigan at different times of day, experimenting with the ways light and shadow could transform the same scene into something entirely different. I painted portraits of the women at Grace House, trying to capture not just their physical features, but something of their strength and dignity in the face of overwhelming challenges. I painted abstract representations of emotions I couldn't put into words: the loneliness of the past year, the anger of feeling taken for granted, the peace of finally learning to value myself. Each painting was an act of prayer, a conversation with God about the beauty and pain and complexity of human experience. Each brushstroke was a small declaration of independence from the woman I had been, the one who lived entirely for other people's approval and had forgotten she was created for purposes beyond their convenience. On a warm evening in June, as I sat in my favorite chair reading The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren, my phone rang. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, my heart didn't race with desperate hope or anxious anticipation. Instead, I felt the calm assurance of someone who knew her worth wasn't dependent on the outcome of this conversation. I knew I was loved by God regardless of whether Tyler had called to apologize or to express more anger about my refusal to provide emergency childcare. I knew my value as a human being wasn't determined by whether my son had finally remembered how to treat me with respect and consideration. "Hello, Tyler," I said, my voice steady and warm. "Mom," he replied, and I could hear something different in his tone: uncertainty, perhaps even humility. I need to talk to you. Could I come over?" I looked around my small apartment, which had been transformed over the past few months from a place of exile into a sanctuary. The walls were decorated with my amateur paintings and photographs from my volunteer work. The kitchen table held books I was reading and letters from women at Grace House who had moved on to independent living. The whole space reflected a life that was full and meaningful and purposeful, regardless of whether anyone else recognized or appreciated it. "Of course," I said. "I'll put some coffee on." As I prepared for Tyler's visit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: I was genuinely curious about what he wanted to discuss, but I wasn't desperate for his approval or terrified of his disapproval. I was simply a woman who had learned to find her completeness in God's love, willing to engage in whatever conversation was coming from a place of strength rather than neediness. Whatever happened next, I knew I would be all right. I had rediscovered who I was beyond my roles as mother and grandmother, and that knowledge had set me free in ways I was still learning to appreciate. The doorbell rang, and I walked toward it with the confident step of a woman who had finally remembered she was worthy of love and respect, regardless of whether the people she loved most were ready to offer either. I was 68 years old, and I was finally living as the daughter of the king I had always been, but had somehow forgotten I was allowed to be. It was time to find out if Tyler was ready to meet the woman his mother had become. Tyler stood at my door holding a bouquet of daffodils, the same flowers I had asked Miguel to place on his father's grave on my forgotten birthday 3 months ago. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. The confident businessman who had dismissed my love as embarrassing was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood a man who looked lost, uncertain, and perhaps for the first time in years, genuinely remorseful. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where to start." I opened the door wider and stepped aside, gesturing for him to come into the apartment that had become my sanctuary. As he entered, I watched him take in the changes I had made. The paintings on the walls, the books scattered on surfaces, the photographs from Grace House showing me surrounded by women whose faces radiated hope and determination. "Your place looks different," he said, settling awkwardly on my couch while I prepared coffee in the kitchen. "It looks like you." The observation surprised me because it suggested he remembered who I was beyond my function as his emergency backup plan. It suggested he could see that I had been creating a life that reflected my own interests and values, rather than simply waiting for his attention. I returned with 2 cups of coffee and my grandmother's butter cookies, the same recipe I had made for Tyler throughout his childhood, though he hadn't tasted them in over 2 years. He accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, and I noticed he looked thinner than usual, as if stress had been stealing his appetite. "I saw the article," he said finally, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. I knew immediately what he meant. The Traverse City Record Eagle had run a feature story the previous week about Grace House and the volunteers who made their programs possible. The reporter had interviewed several of us, including a lengthy section about my work with women transitioning to independent living. The headline had read, "Local grandmother finds new purpose helping women rebuild their lives." The article had included a photograph of me with Maria Santos and her children at their graduation ceremony from the shelter's financial literacy program. In the picture, I was smiling genuinely, not the strained expression I had worn for years while trying to convince myself I was happy, but the radiant joy of someone who had found meaningful work and authentic community. "Mrs. Foster has shown me what it means to be strong," Maria had been quoted as saying. "She teaches us that starting over is not failure, it is courage. She shows us every day that we are worthy of love and respect, even when the world tells us we are not." The article had gone on to describe my background as a widow who had found her calling, in service to other women, mentioning my decades of experience managing households, and my natural ability to offer both practical guidance and emotional support. It had painted a picture of someone whose life was full and purposeful, someone who was making a real difference in her community. "I had no idea," Tyler continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea you were doing all of this. I had no idea you were helping people, that you were building something beautiful." I sipped my coffee and waited, sensing that he needed time to find the words for whatever he had come to say. The silence between us felt different from the awkward pauses that had characterized our recent conversations. This felt like the quiet of someone gathering courage rather than the emptiness of people who had nothing to say to each other. "Sarah and I have been having problems," he admitted suddenly, looking up at me with eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when storms frightened him. "Big problems. We've been seeing a counselor, trying to figure out why our marriage feels so empty." Why we're both so unhappy, even though we have everything we thought we wanted. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The counselor asked us to talk about our families, about the patterns we learned growing up, he continued. She asked us to think about how we treat the people we say we love, about whether our actions match our words. I felt a flicker of hope, but I kept my expression neutral. I had learned not to invest too heavily in conversations that might be leading somewhere meaningful, had discovered the importance of listening without immediately offering forgiveness or making excuses for behavior that had caused genuine harm. I started thinking about you, Tyler said, his voice breaking slightly. I started thinking about how I've treated you over the past few years, and I was horrified. I was ashamed. I realized that I've been treating the person who loved me most like she was disposable, like her feelings didn't matter, like she existed only to solve my problems. Tears began flowing down his cheeks, and he didn't try to wipe them away. I realized that I've been teaching Emma that it's okay to take advantage of people who love you, that some people's needs don't matter as much as your own convenience. I've been showing her that love is conditional, that it's okay to discard people when they're no longer useful to you. He looked directly at me for the first time since arriving, his eyes searching my face for some sign of how I was receiving his words. "Mom, I am so sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush of remorse and recognition. "I am so sorry for forgetting who you are, for treating you like hired help instead of like the woman who gave me everything she had. I'm sorry for making you feel embarrassed about loving me publicly. I'm sorry for only calling when I needed something. I'm sorry for responding to news of your injury with an emoji." He paused, struggling to continue through his tears. "I'm sorry for missing your birthday. I'm sorry for not knowing about your volunteer work, for not asking about your life, for not caring about your happiness. I'm sorry for teaching Emma that her grandmother is someone to be ashamed of instead of someone to treasure and learn from." The apology was everything I had dreamed of hearing for months, but it arrived at a time when I no longer needed it for my own emotional survival. I had already done the work of finding my worth in God's love, rather than Tyler's approval. I had already learned to build a meaningful life that didn't depend on his recognition or participation. That didn't make his words less meaningful, but it meant I could receive them from a place of strength, rather than desperate need. "Tyler," I said gently, "I forgive you. I forgave you long before you asked, because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was helping anything. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending that what happened didn't matter. And it doesn't mean going back to the way things were." He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that reminded me of the 6-year-old who had cried when his pet hamster died. "I know," he said. "I know I can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. I know I have to prove that I've learned from this, that I'm willing to do the work to rebuild our relationship in a healthier way." "What does that look like to you?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether he understood the depth of the changes that would be required. "It means calling you just to talk, not because I need something," he said, ticking off items on his fingers as if he had been making a mental list. "It means inviting you to Emma's birthday party and Christmas dinner, and all the family occasions we've been excluding you from. It means asking about your volunteer work, and your painting, and your life, not just waiting for you to ask about mine." He took a shaky breath before continuing. "It means teaching Emma that her grandmother is someone special, someone whose wisdom and experience are valuable, someone who deserves respect and love and attention. It means Sarah and I learning to plan ahead for childcare instead of treating you like our emergency backup plan. Those are good starts," I said carefully. "But Tyler, the most important thing you need to understand is that I've built a life that's full and meaningful without your participation. I've found purpose and community and joy that don't depend on whether you include me in your family activities." I gestured toward the photographs on my walls, the evidence of the rich life I had created in his absence. "I won't go back to being the woman who lived entirely for crumbs of affection from people who took her for granted," I continued. "I won't go back to measuring my worth by whether you need me or appreciate me. I won't go back to being available for every crisis while being excluded from every celebration." Tyler nodded, his expression serious. "I don't want you to go back to that either," he said. "I want to learn to love you the way you deserve to be loved. I want to be the kind of son who adds joy to your life instead of taking it away. We talked for 2 more hours, discussing specific ways our relationship could be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Tyler asked about my work at Grace House, listened intently as I described the women I was mentoring and the programs we were developing. He admired my paintings, asked about my Bible study group, showed genuine interest in the life I had created for myself. Most importantly, he brought Emma with him when he returned the following Sunday for dinner, not because he needed childcare, but because he wanted his daughter to spend time with her grandmother in a relaxed, unhurried environment. Watching Emma toddle around my apartment, exploring the books and art supplies I had left within her reach, seeing her laugh with delight at the simple games we played together, I felt a joy that was different from the desperate gratitude I had once felt for any access to my granddaughter's life. This was the joy of genuine relationship, of being valued for who I was rather than used for what I could provide. Over the following months, Tyler kept his promises. He called regularly, not with requests for favors, but with updates about his life and genuine questions about mine. He and Sarah invited me to family gatherings, including me in holiday celebrations and weekend activities. They asked for my advice about parenting decisions and listened respectfully to my suggestions. Most importantly, they began treating me like a cherished family member rather than a convenient resource. Sarah even apologized, acknowledging that she had been influenced by her own family dynamics and hadn't understood how her treatment of me had contributed to the breakdown in our relationship. I was taught that in-laws are people you have to tolerate rather than embrace, she admitted during one particularly honest conversation. I didn't realize that I was missing out on a relationship with someone who could have been a genuine friend and mentor if I had made the effort to get to know her. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Emma. As she grew older and spent more time with me, she began to see me not as a stranger who occasionally appeared to solve her parents' problems, but as her grandmother, someone who loved her unconditionally, who delighted in her accomplishments, who was always available to listen to her stories and share in her adventures. "Grandma Sharon," she said to me on her 3rd birthday, as we sat in my garden painting pictures of flowers, "I love you more than all the stars in the sky." The words were almost identical to what Tyler had written in that construction paper card 30 years earlier, and they reminded me that love, real love, has a way of persisting across generations when it's nurtured with patience and wisdom. Today, as I write this story, I am 70 years old. Tyler and I have a relationship that is honest and reciprocal, built on mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation. Emma knows she has a grandmother who treasures her, who is interested in her thoughts and feelings, who will always be there to listen and support and love her unconditionally. But most importantly, I know who I am beyond my relationships with other people. I am Sharon Foster, daughter of the King, created for purposes that extend far beyond the roles others might assign to me. I am a woman whose worth is not dependent on external validation, whose joy is not contingent on other people's approval, whose peace comes from walking closely with the God who has never forgotten my name or abandoned me in my struggles. The women at Grace House still call me their angel. But I know the truth. I was the one who was rescued, the one who was transformed, the one who learned that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest disappointments. Have you ever felt forgotten by someone you love? Have you ever found yourself wondering if your sacrifices were seen and valued by the people who mattered most to you? Has faith helped you through seasons of loneliness and rejection? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this message touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to this channel so that it can reach someone else who needs to hear that they are not forgotten, that their worth is not determined by other people's ability to see it, and that God's love is always available to fill the empty spaces in our hearts. May God bless everyone who has walked through the valley of feeling unloved and unvalued. May you find your way to the mountaintop of knowing who you are in Him. In Jesus' name, amen.